Welcome to my podcast, The Sexual Shaman, Conversations on Sexuality and Spirituality. I am your host, Kenneth Ray Stubbs. This podcast videocast series is inspired by a book I envisioned, contributed to, edited, and published 30 years ago entitled Women of the Light, the New Sacred Prostitute. This current podcast is a series of conversations with both women and men of the light, all about sexuality and spirituality. Here we openly support all sexual orientations, all genders, all gender identifications, all races, and all ethnicities. The sponsor of this podcast is my energy training, an extensive 20-course program in generating our intrinsic energy and transforming ourselves and others. More information is available at sexualshaman.com. Welcome to the Sexual Shaman podcast. I'm Kenneth Ray Stubbs, and today my guest is Anna Howard, who lives in the UK. She has some very unique experiences to be able to speak about the topic that we'll be focusing on today, which I'm entitling Sexuality, Celibacy, and the Monastery. Both Anna and I have been extensively, she far more than I, have been involved in Tibetan Buddhist traditions, meditations, and being with different lamas. She's also lived in a monastic community in the UK. This is something she talks about in a book that she has written. It is not yet published, but the working title is No Going Back, A Quest for Enlightenment. And she shares in that book some of her experiences of being in a monastic context, the problematic aspects where when love and our sexual attraction or something of that nature comes up. We often think of religious traditions as being rather anti-sexual in one way or another. And so we want to explore that today in Sexuality, Celibacy, and the Monastery. First, I want to welcome Anna Howard from the UK. Welcome, Anna. Thank you very much for joining in here. Your background is so varied. You said your degree was in psychology. You went into broadcasting, and then you went into being a healer, as in somatic, hands-on, energetic. And that just sort of kept expanding, eventually into Tibetan Buddhism. Could you sum up this varied life? I don't know what to say about you.
That's the whole idea.
That's the whole idea. So your path leads you to, what's the name of the community in the UK, in Scotland? And it was called?
Samye Ling.
How do you spell that?
SamyeLing.
All right. And that was started by two Tibetan monks who escaped from Tibet. When Mao came in with his armies, eventually they left, these two monks, and made their way eventually to England. The one that we know most of is Chogyam Trungpa, who eventually left there, that monastery where you were referring, and came to the U.S. and was a major influence for a lot of people around this whole topic of Buddhism and meditation. First of all, let's look at this whole concept of sexuality, celibacy, and the monastery. I'm using the word monastery to refer to in either a single building or a community of buildings. Often it's only one sex, as in only male or only female. But I've noticed in So in the Tibetan Buddhist context, it's been both male and female, maybe living in separate buildings. Or when I was in the Tibetan Buddhist Center on retreat, we all stayed in the same dorm, different rooms, but the same dorm. So it doesn't hold quite the same idea as in Catholic monasteries. And I've been to Catholic monasteries on retreat, and it's been all male, all male, all male. Here that we're looking at a place where people usually live in a community and involved in an ongoing practice for our concept of monastery. Is that suitable for you?
Yes, I'd say that Samye Ling was very unusual. I mean, I can say a little bit about that if you'd like me to.
Yes.
So Samye Ling is a very unusual place, was the first Tibetan Buddhist monastery center in the West, 1967. So it's been around a long time. And very unusually, it has both monks and nuns and a lay community all living together in separate buildings for the monks and the nuns. The lay community also have their own dwelling. Everybody comes together in the temple, everybody comes together to work, everybody comes together for dinner and meals in the dining room. So there is a lot of mixing of people who have very different vows or no vows at all. And that is a hotbed, you could say, for sexuality to come up in the mix and for people to struggle with that, with what to do with that. Because obviously if you're a monk or you're a nun, then you do take vows of celibacy. So you are not given training, as far as I know. I didn't become a nun. I was always a lay person. But as my understanding is that nobody was given any training as to what to do with their sexual desire, with their sexual energy. So for some people, depending on their age, depending on their basic nature, their basic sexual drive, that was more difficult than for other people.
All right. Well, I do want to add in here that the first Tibetan Lama I studied with, Tartang Tulku, established the Nyingma Institute in Berkeley, California. Quit a job so I could spend a month with him. For a whole month, being in a program with him. It was really awesome and transformative. And he is from the Nyingma tradition, which the monks, or we could say priests, but the monks can marry. And so that there is variation on that. And that was my first introduction to Tibetan Buddhism. I married with children and living in that area. So there is some variation on that, but the idea is that the monastery usually has some concern about sexuality, because when I was at the Tibetan Buddhist Center, just taking courses, the head of the center told me not to talk about sexuality, because they knew that I taught what I call erotic massage, and they weren't saying don't come around, or that what I was doing was bad or evil or sinful or anything like that. But they said just don't talk about it. So and so I was being accepted fully, but just don't talk about it. So that's another way of relating to this. Let's look at celibacy. What is celibacy? Well, I don't know what people mean by celibacy. One, it could be that people are not having genital contact, as in coitus. But if you're same sex, the genital contact would not be technically what we think of as coitus. And celibacy means no self-pleasuring, as in no masturbation. Or does celibacy simply mean you may have sex, but you don't get married, so that your commitment is to the tradition, and you do not form a household, but that does not mean you're not sexually active. So
my understanding would be that celibacy was very definitely no sexual contact at all, especially when you take vows. The understanding is that you are not engaging in sexual relations, you're not engaging in self-pleasure, you are very much working on the desire in your own mind, working on it with your practice to transform it, because it's one of the most, if not the most powerful force that we have. And for most of us, perhaps without much wisdom, which is one of the things you develop in Tibetan Buddhism, hopefully, is wisdom, but the powerful desire that we have tends to pull us into all sorts of sometimes very complicated relationships with other people. Sometimes there's a lot of pleasure, but usually there's suffering somewhere along the line, and certainly confusion. So the whole of the way in which the desire energy pulls people into relationship with each other and then creates attachment and jealousy and all of these complicated emotions. One of the reasons why people who are serious about training on the path of Buddhism, and possibly in other traditions as well, is to try to short circuit some of those obvious sources of problem and distraction, so that you just say, we're not even going to engage in sexual energy, we're not going to engage in sexual relationships or any kind of emotional relationship, really. We're not going to whip up that energy. We're going to try and accept the energy, but we're going to renounce physical contact, and we're going to work with that energy internally to try to use it as a fire, the fire within. So if you can pull your energy up through your meditation practice, then because it's very lower energy, the pure desire, but once it starts coming up the body, through the body, it's creative energy, then it's the awakened heart energy. It can blossom into a loving energy, compassion, and then further up our body it goes, then it becomes more like enlightenment, you could say, more like clarity and wisdom. And so it's not that there's any judgment about sexuality ultimately at all, actually, except that it can cause problems. It's more recognizing the power of it and changing how you use that power, using that power to transform yourself from within. So that's one of the reasons, that's the wisdom behind the celibacy, so that you can really focus on your own energy and focus on your own training. At a certain point within Tibetan Buddhism, and I don't know whether this is unique to Tibetan Buddhism, but it's certainly quite unusual, there are practices you can engage in, but again, these are generally practices that are taught to people in long retreat or who've got a very advanced development, because the potential for danger and problems is huge when you start going down this road. But you can start to work with sexual energy in such a way that you are engaging in union with a partner, but you're not engaging in union on the basis of any kind of real lust or any kind of desire for self-gratification, or that's not the motivation for engaging in the union. The motivation is much more to do with generating the bliss energy. And you do that through breathing techniques, you do that through visualizing your energy. There is heat, there is connection and love, and those emotions may be present, but the whole process, it's like a process, it's like a meditation ritual, is to generate this bliss energy. And bliss, by its own nature, helps to liberate us from the more, what they call samsaric problems of attachment and the mental obstacles, the confusions we have. Somehow bliss by nature, perhaps because it's a very high frequency, allows these things to naturally evaporate. So it can be a fast track to enlightenment, to practice in that way. But you really need a lot of skill, a lot of discipline, a lot of knowledge. You need a partner who's on the same wavelength. And then you engage in this practice in such a way that it's not about going for pleasure at all. It's working with this energy in such a way that actually you get the ultimate pleasure, if you like, want to use that word, which is this bliss energy.
All right. Just to clarify, when you were saying union a little bit earlier, you were referring to actual genital interaction?
Yes, it can be, not always. You can definitely, it's a particular karma mudra is the name for that. But you can also do it just simply by being present with another person in that way, by eye gazing, something like that can generate a lot of energy. And so it doesn't have to be full union, but it can be. Yeah.
Okay. This is indeed a debatable question. Because what do I teach about? It's about energy, which embraces sexuality, but does not involve sexual activity unless you want to. And the point is, I think that's often, as I was coming into sort of a spiritual orientation, as in, from Eastern tradition, kept hearing the ideas that you don't focus on the first three chakras in the pelvic area and abdomen, but it's the fourth, the heart up, that those are energy centers. And that never made sense to me, because if you're suppressing your sexual nature, or from the abdomen down, that is going to explode into this sexual dysfunctionality that we see so predominant in the Catholic Church and in the Protestant churches I grew up in, where sexuality becomes out expressed in abusive ways. So this is a real debatable question. So we're not going to answer and solve that question, but we do want to look at the different approaches.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question and topic. It really is, because I think in some of the traditions you're talking about, and perhaps the Christian ones, I mean, I grew up in that context, and there's definitely a sense that the spirituality is at odds with sexuality. They're going in different directions.
Yes.
One is going into the pleasures of the flesh, is going into the sin area, and if you really want to be heading up to heaven, then you give all that up, and that causes us so much conflict and pain and suffering and confusion, and doesn't serve spirituality. It doesn't serve sexuality, in my view. And so I was very relieved to find in Buddhism that in the tantric path of Vajrayana, the Tibetan Buddhism, nothing is rejected. So there may be an emphasis on celibacy if you're taking a monastic, vows, obviously, but it's not rejecting your sexuality. It's not making it wrong. It's not saying there's anything wrong with it. It's actually saying, this is a powerful part of you. Let's use it in a different way to aid your spiritual growth, your wholeness, your healing, your enlightenment. So, but when you have young people, and when I was in the monastery, we were all in our 30s.
Yeah, horny town.
We were horny. And, when people are sitting meditating, their energy is really quite high. So everybody becomes super attractive anyway. You're sort of glowing with this wonderful energy. And you're in the presence of these amazing teachers who bring bliss out. So, I mean, it's asking for trouble. And I did get myself into a fair amount of trouble. I own that. But there was a little difficulty for people trying to manage this, trying to harness this energy, or trying to sort of work with it in skillful, harmonious ways, because we were all living in community, all so close to each other all the time. But I think it is important to say that nobody was, if people weren't in robes, then sexual relationships were going on all the time. The problem was if you were in robes and you were trying to live that life, or you were a mixture. As in my case, I wasn't in robes, but I was falling in love with monks who were in robes, and that was difficult.
Yes. It. Gosh, boy, I did not anticipate in our discussion that in my mind would open a can of worms. Oh my goodness, we got. I'd sort of, because I found most religions, including Tibetan Buddhism, to be so limited around dealing with sexuality, that I had to find it elsewhere, and how to deal with it. So I was taking, I remember that a week-long retreat in this 9-month program it was 5 nights a week and 3-week-long retreat to the Tibetan Buddhist Center. And after a week of that retreat, I immediately left that and came over to San Francisco to the Institute for the Advanced Study of Human Sexuality, where I taught, because it was going to be an 8-day program on sexuality. And so it's sort of, I went from a week of silence and, of course, not being sexual, not that there was not likely to be much sexuality there anyway, but for that week, but it went from that to this other place where it was totally embraced about sexuality. Therapists, sex therapists, and counselors coming from different places in the world to do this program for 8 days. And I saw my friend, who was a OBGYN, big guy, and I hadn't seen him for a number of months. And as I came in, I just wanted a hug. So I jumped into his arms and put my legs around his waist. He was a very big, tall, strong guy. And it's sort of like, oh, I can touch again. I can hug again. I'm in a place where sexuality is okay again. And so I kept living that life of I had to integrate on my own.
I guess I'd say I did the same, had to integrate on my own. Yeah.
Yes. None of the Tibetan lamas that I've studied with really talked about sexuality. And maybe if you went to one-to-one consulting, they might, I don't know, maybe they did. But I think it's problematic when a tradition does not openly examine how to relate to this question, because it's a very important question. The same thing is for a lot of professions. People who do professional touch, as in massage, chiropractic, rolfing, hands-on type of somatic healing things. Sexuality is going to come up. But they don't want to, I've found that these professions are in denial. And that's what I found in the massage profession. I went to massage school in 1973, and after doing massage for a couple of years, I felt like, well, sexuality energy is going to come up. So I started to teach erotic massage for couples. And this was a real stretch. The point is that until we really relate to the question of our sexual nature and sexual expression, if we just try to suppress even thinking about it, then when it does come up and come out, it often comes up in explosive, dysfunctional ways. You said that, this question, this challenge came up while you were in the monastic context. How did you deal with it, or attempt to deal with it? Did you have any thoughts on that? Because it's a question that's going to come up, and I don't think we have any answers.
No, and it definitely came up for me. And I remember the first time that it was an issue was in my early days there, actually, because I'd fallen in love with one of the monks, and I was a very romantic, or I still am, very romantic sort of person. So in my mind, being in love was not a problem, because it was, if spirituality isn't about expanding our capacity to love, then what is it about? And for me, because in that context, the spirituality was so strong, the love was there, the attraction was there, it all felt like one to me. So the sexuality, as it began to present itself, in my mind, was something to wait for. So in other words, if this relationship had a future, then we need to take it seriously, and he would need to think about giving up his vows so that we could, for all intents and purposes, become a couple, maybe get married. I was very into that idea, and bring everything together, still with this spiritual focus as a big part of our life. So that was my solution in my mind. But what I didn't really realize at all was that the abbot, who is still the abbot actually, was very keen on people being monks and nuns, because he'd seen all the problems that young people were experiencing. And a lot of people that came to Samye Ling did have quite serious problems in many cases. So for him to give people the opportunity to take robes and to take the vows, celibacy vows being one of them, there were other vows as well, was giving them a real chance to sort their heads out, to get themselves onto a level playing field and an even keel, a stable footing, and to really develop their own potential, free of all the distractions and attractions of the worldly life. So when I came along, and I wasn't the only one, but unfortunately the person I fell in love with was a senior monk. I was deemed something of a Jezebel, to say the least. And
A what did you say?
A Jezebel.
Jezebel. All right.
Jezebel. And asked to leave in no uncertain terms because they thought my motivation was simply that, simply to pull a monk off the path and to get him from my own selfish ends, which it really wasn't. At least I don't think it was, but that was how it was perceived. So I went from being this really quite good girl who was following her heart and following the spirituality and given everything up to go and live in the monastery, sold my house, done the lot. Suddenly I was this devil incarnate and I wasn't wanted, and they were like trying to get rid of me. I couldn't understand what had happened, and it was simply this sexual energy was presenting itself through this situation so strongly that it was frightening people around. It was like, this is dangerous. She's going to cause trouble. So in the end, I ended up persuading the abbot that I really wasn't there just for those nefarious motives. I really had a genuine interest in the path and a genuine interest in Buddhism. So I was allowed to stay, and things with my monk friend kind of stabilized a little bit. But actually it became more and more difficult because there was such a strong attraction and a strong connection. It was all together. And had we both been more skilled practitioners, maybe we would have been a good couple to be in one of these tantric practices together. But we weren't. We weren't particularly well experienced. We weren't particularly sorted in our own hearts or minds. So it was actually a bit of a recipe for a disaster. And in the end, my friend did leave. He left the monastery, not specifically because of me, but really because he was so confronted by what was happening within him. And he realized, having been there a few years, that actually maybe this was a catalyst to move him out of the monastery, back into the world, where he could then engage with relationships again. Wasn't with me. He did leave and he did go back into the world. Our relationship finished. But that was how I tried to deal with it at that point. And once I was on my own, broken-hearted in the monastery, you wouldn't believe it, Ray, but I then went and fell in love with another monk. This is so embarrassing.
All we need is love. All we need is love. Yes, go ahead.
So unfortunately, I didn't learn by my mistakes. I thought I had done, because this person was a completely different kind of person. We'd been great friends. We were doing everything very, very consciously, and we tried very much to work within the confines and context of the community. But once we decided we did want to be together, we did all this very officially, we were told, no, you can't. If you want to be together, you both have to leave, and neither of you will be ever welcome again. So just think about it seriously. And then my friend went to speak to the founder of Samye Ling, who was somebody that he really, really respected, and as did I. And he never had any kind of problem with whatever went wrong. Akon Rinpoche was unfazed. He was the most expanded, incredible, enlightened human being. And I really loved him, and as did my friend. So when he said to my friend, simply, she's not the right woman for you, that was devastating to him and to me, because that meant that was the way of ending it. Because as soon as my friend had been told that, from his point of view, that was it. There was no point continuing. So at that point, I was expelled from the monastery. for real this time, and had to go off on my own, and had to go off up north to Scotland, further into Scotland, to try and come to terms with all of this, to try to come to terms with my broken heart, my tattered reputation, the fact that I got no home, I got no, honestly, I went from, my quest for enlightenment was just crashing and burning in every single direction. And it was very stressful, very challenging. I think I came quite close to breakdown in a funny way, because all my values, everything I believed in, everything was being challenged. And I was seen as this awful woman, which is not how I perceived myself. And I was also confronted with this thing with why is sexuality such a problem? Why have I, because I'm a sexual woman, ended up in this situation where I'm homeless, everything's gone wrong, simply because of this energy. So that was what I was left with through those experiences. And then over time, I did reconcile the whole situation within myself, as in I could see, took years, but I could see eventually exactly why the abbot was coming from, what he was trying to establish at Samye Ling, and why the presence of somebody like me and others, but I seemed to be the one that was coming under the spotlight, why it would cause such difficulties, and why in their mind it was better to get rid of me, although not, that's being a little bit harsh, but it did feel like the community and the Lama were trying to get rid of me because I was causing trouble. And it wasn't a deliberate thing at all, but because my connection with Tibetan Buddhism was so strong, and my commitment actually to the path was so strong, I kept being allowed back in again. So that was my very, very turbulent experience of trying to balance sexuality and celibacy in a monastery. It was very, very difficult.
Yes, I can understand. I do want to share what keeps popping up in my intuition here. As you're talking about this, the question is, how does one deal with, how does one be on what we might call spiritual path and relate sexuality? One approach has been to do celibacy, to sort of like say, okay, no engagement with that activity, at least. And I look at, and what keeps coming up is how it has worked for me, some of the steps. And I talked about a little while ago about teaching erotic massage to people of all sexual orientations. But one of the things that I did was, in the San Francisco Bay Area, there was a swing club. Swingers, the term is used for, in this case, male and female twosomes to come together in the evening at a party context, where there'd be food. And the agreement was that you could be sexual with anyone that wanted to be sexual, including people that you were not in a focused relationship with. And I was hired as a masseur to come in for 3 hours. And for 3 hours straight, I would do 10-minute massages on people. It was not a sexual massage, but they could get all the sex they could possibly want. And so my objective was to accomplish in 10 minutes what would maybe in an hour could be accomplished in a regular massage. What was interesting about this for me is the room that I was in was right beside the group room. And if you went into the group room, I mean, you were open to anybody and everybody. And so for 3 hours, we would hear this, people having orgasm after orgasm after orgasm and after orgasm after orgasm. So all that sexual energy was there. I figured in the massage, there's no need to focus on including the genitals or go to the sexual nature, because they roll off the bed and just go party, party, party for a long time. But I was totally immersed in all of that sexual activity, around where I was, the sounds, the energy of it. That is a whole nother approach where you totally go deeply into the energy. And what I learned from that is to relate to the energy, by immersing in myself in that energy. And it was packed energy, sexual energy. And to feel into it in a what I would call a meditative way was a very important training for me, rather than go to disengagement to, in a sense, engagement with the energy, but staying with the energy focus because of, like I said, on the one hand, I was doing all this meditation in Tibetan Buddhist meditation, for example. And on the other hand, I was involved in the field of Western sexology and Tantra. And so I could bring it together with the meditative awareness, which I think is so awesome, so powerful. And the Tibetan Buddhists, they know how to do it. But I don't think they're teaching it, not to the general public. They're teaching nice philosophy, and it's. I find it frustrating because I've learned so much from the Tibetan lamas, but it wasn't because of their outward teaching; is how they're functioning energetically, and that's a whole nother approach. So it's not the external activity so much as how you tune into the energies, and you get into that energetic simpatico. What I call oneness with another person, which I really learned from shamanism. For a shaman, for a healer to be a really effective healer in a shamanic way, for an established, most people who are on a shamanic path are not really developed this way, has been my observation. But I was fortunate to be with some shamans who, to do their healing, they literally went into an energetic oneness, simpatico with the person. So they had to energetically be like the client or the person coming in for the healing, to duplicate that pattern within themselves, but not take it on as their own pattern, as an empath. In other words, you don't have to have a headache because the other person has a headache. You are able to duplicate that pattern with you. To be an effective healer, you have to do that. With sexuality, guess what happens in orgasm? The same happens. You go into this energetic simpatico for a moment where you were each other energetically, literally. This comes from my observation. No one taught me this or told me this, but I just perceiving energetic patterns, being around a lot of sexual activity and group sex. Say, oh, this is what's happening. This is what the shaman was doing. But the shaman was doing it in a non-sexual context, and the people in the sexual, swing parties, they're doing it in a sexual context. But
same result.
It's the same thing. And by my embracing the sexuality, but coming from an awareness that I learned from shamans and Tibetan Buddhist lamas of tuning into the energy, then that opens up the methodologies or approaches to relate to that. So you embrace your sexuality. Now, I've been quadriplegic for 30 years. And for the last 20 years, I've been celibate. Not to be celibate per se, but because the body doesn't work certain ways. And I found that I can get much more satisfaction out of an energetic connection with a person than I can probably with physically limited physical interaction. So I was sort of thrown into this, but I had to have all that meditative background. But unfortunately, they're not. It's being taught, but it's not being related to sexuality. So you got to go to these swing parties, have a lot of sex and orgasm being around you, and then just soak it up, and tune into it and groove on it. So that's a quick answer to say, it's too bad that these religious traditions have got some of the answers, but they're in denial around sexuality. And the way it comes out is in a very, very, unfortunately, dysfunctional ways.
Yes, and I think I agree with you. And I think it's interesting when you're talking about those swinging parties, when you're completely immersed in all that sexual energy.
Yes.
But when you're in that energy, in a more meditative state, because of the work you were doing at the time, it's as if you can be right in the midst of the desire energy. And for most of us, desire is what projects us outwards, projects us into something, into a sexual encounter, into a relationship, whatever. But when you're in the desire energy and you're just in it, then something else happens that's, I think, very transformative. And I think the desire energy at its most pure, you could say, is this bliss, is this
Yes. Yes. It's a bliss, humming, vibration, throughout, not just in certain areas that we associate with certain areas of our physical body.
No.
It is throughout. And
my experience of being with some of the teachers, particularly the person I would call my root teacher, Akon Rinpoche, who founded Samye Ling, is that I had encounters with him one-to-one on a regular basis. And there was something about who he was and the nature of our connection where I would sit with him maybe for 5 minutes and we would have a conversation. He was a man of very few words. He didn't say very much, but I would come out of that interview, it was always called an interview, completely like I'd just been in the most extraordinary lovemaking experience with somebody. It wasn't a sexual feeling. It was a very expanded, very peaceful, very calm, very blissful. I felt like I could take on the world and do anything. It was an extraordinary experience and nothing had happened. Nothing.
In terms of physical activity.
Exactly. But the communion, if you like, or the energetic transmission,
yes,
from him to me, and my resonance with that because of the connection, which was a very heart-centered one, was off. No human relationships ever come anywhere near that.
Yeah. Anything you'd like to say, Anna, to complete this portion?
I think I'd just like to pick up on what you were talking just now about the nature of spiritual desire, because I think that's the point, is that when you are in a monastic environment, you do have spiritual desire.
Yeah.
And therefore you do have your sexual desire will come up. It just will, because in a way, for that process to be a functional, healthy, complete, successful one, it's the wholeness of who we are. Wholeness is holiness. So that energy is going to come up. And I do think monasteries, institutions, religious groups would be wise to look at ways to help people work with that in skillful ways.
Yes.
Rather than making a mess of it as I did.
Yes.
And learning the hard way and then having to work it out for yourself.
Yes, I agree. So, Anna, thank you so much for joining and just looking at this whole question so that others who are in a similar focus or interest can say, oh, that they're not weird, they're not alone, and that others have traveled this road before, and it will continue to be traveled. If you're open to your aliveness, you got to open to the whole spectrum, and how we choose to express it. That is another question, and that's an important question. Anna, thank you so much for joining in. And gosh, I wish we could come up with the answers, but there ain't going to be no answers. Been this with us for humanity, and it's an ongoing seeking path. That will be for both of us. Thank you very much, Anna. Welcome back to part 2 with Anna Howard, the Sexual Shaman podcast. Conversations on sexuality and spirituality. And I'm here with Anna, who is in the UK. I'm in Arizona, in the Sonoran Desert, and Anna is in the UK. And we're discussing sexuality, celibacy, and the monastery. And in this part 2, I really would like to hear from Anna. She's had opportunities to be with some really highly developed Tibetan Buddhist lamas. And when I read their energetic patterns that she's referred to, these lamas, they're really highly energetically developed and develop what I call the rainbow body. And when someone develops this energetic structure that's referred to as a rainbow body, at least the way that I characterize the concept of the rainbow body, they develop an energetic functionality so that others will see in the person's behavior, attitude, philosophy, intelligence, something that might be referred to as enlightened. So to me, enlightenment is an energetic concept. But people who are called enlightened are called enlightened because others say that they're enlightened. And on his book, that has not yet been published, No Going Back, A Quest for Enlightenment, I think is a good place to start looking at this question of enlightenment. Anna, how would you characterize enlightenment?
Gosh, that's a $60 million question, that one.
Yes. I've spent years looking at that question. I have sort of an answer now, but that's just sort of my answer. It's a way of thinking about it.
Well, my answer at the moment would be, because I do think the more we develop, perhaps the more inevitably we would understand what is meant by enlightenment. So as I understand it, our consciousness is inherently made up, if you like, of 2 dimensions. What you might call the absolute dimension, which you might also refer to as pure awareness. And you might call the relative dimension, which is the more personalized individual consciousness, which is what most of us identify with and identify as. So when I use the term I'm often referring to my understanding of who I am as Anna Howard. So my identity as a woman, I live in the UK, this is my name, this is my family, etc., etc., etc. That's my personality self, my individual self. That's my relative self. That's not enlightened and never ever will be. So when we talk about wanting to be enlightened, it's usually the ego self that is wanting to be enlightened. And the ego self can never be enlightened, just can't happen. And in fact, we already are enlightened, as my understanding is it, that at the level of our pure awareness, which is already totally enlightened, already completely imbued with all the qualities of enlightenment, which would be characterized as compassion, joy, equanimity, peace, love. All of that is already intrinsically there, so that you don't have to develop those things. What we need to do for that enlightened nature to reveal itself is to go beyond the ego, lose the ego, dissolve the ego. So that's how I understand both enlightenment as a way of perceiving everything. It's a perceptual shift, I think, that happens. And suddenly you're no longer seeing the world from that dualistic self and other, subject-object perspective, which is what we mostly do. We're in the oneness. We're in that oneness, unified consciousness where I am simply pure awareness. There's no real personality there. There's no real kind of sense of an individual self. Certainly there's no self-grasping. There's much more of a sense of clarity and presence of this pure awareness, which has its own intelligence and knows how to interact, and interacts by nature with compassion and wisdom. So that's how I would define enlightenment.
All right. And you've been around several lamas from our talks for the last few years that I would say would fit my particular definition of enlightenment, just based on looking at their energetic patterns. You explained in part one some experiences you would have when you were with this particular Rinpoche or Lama, high-level Lama called Rinpoche. Being, after 5 minutes, you come out feeling like you're in a blissful space, just from being energetic. Can you characterize more about these teachers that you had found so beneficial, how that impacted you, influenced you? Because the teachers, in terms of how they're emanating or transmitting, I think is the real teaching rather than the philosophy that they're speaking. The real enlightenment expression is there in the energetic, vibratory communion.
Yes.
Can you speak to that more, to that aspect? Because you more than probably anyone else that I know personally, have had the opportunity to spend time more than just a few hours here or a class here and there with such people. Can you characterize your experience of being in their energy field, we'll say?
Yes, and what I'd like to begin with, if I may, is a story that I think explains better than I can in words in many ways just how powerful these beings can be. So before I'd even met Akon Rinpoche, who's the one that we're speaking about, the one that was my closest, my heart teacher, my roots guru, I was at Samye Ling, and I had gone up to Edinburgh, which was about 65 miles, 80 kilometers away from Samye Ling. And I suddenly started at lunchtime that particular day to feel incredibly tired, like unusually tired. So much so that I was concerned that I wasn't going to be able to drive back again. So I said to my colleague, can we go back? Because I don't feel so good. I felt fine, but I put it in those terms. So we drove back to Samye Ling, and the closer we got to Samye Ling, this feeling got stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger, until by the time I got back to my room, I was literally on my knees. I could hardly walk. I crawled into my bedroom. I just lay on the floor, and with these waves of bliss just pouring through me, and I had no idea what was going on. I just remember before I fell asleep thinking, God, what's this all about? Maybe somebody must be here. So I woke up the next day, and I felt fine the next day, went to breakfast, started hearing people talking in the background about Akon Rinpoche. And I just said to them, I said, oh, is Akon Rinpoche back? And they said, oh, yes, he came back yesterday lunchtime. He flew in, he'd come back from Tibet, which was exactly the point that I started to feel this feeling all those miles away, having never met him in this life before. So that, to me, was somebody who had an exceptionally high vibration and frequency, and it was emitting, it was powerfully transmitting itself all those miles away. And I was in tune enough, because of, who knows, perhaps past life connection with that, to be able to feel an impact on it. So when you talk about what impact these people can have on us, I think it's also important to say that somebody else who equally enlightened may not have any impact on me personally at all, or on you. It's a very individual thing. You have a certain connections with people. It's just, it works with some people, like with a partnership. It works with some, it doesn't work with others. But everybody's Rinpoches are, if you have that title, it's an honorific title, which means you are a precious teacher. You are probably enlightened or very highly realized. So the impact is always energetic. It's always, my experience has been that on an everyday basis, especially in an interview setting, or in that rather unique experience I had, there was the feeling of huge expansion, the mind going into real harmony. So it just harmonizes, which means the body feels in real harmony as well. Everything feels totally great, but not in a kind of spaced out way. You're very grounded. It's a inner harmony. It's peace. It feels like you've come home within yourself. It feels like everything is perfect the way it is, that you are your best self, perhaps, is one way of putting it. Another context that I have experienced these beings, these people, these teachers, is in the classic Tibetan Buddhist context called an empowerment or an initiation rite, which is what is given if you want to do a particular practice. When you're doing the deity practice, that's one of the ways that you're working on your own mind and one of the ways you're developing yourself spiritually. And to do the deity practice, you need to have an empowerment, which is when the teacher effectively becomes that deity and transmits the pure essence of that deity to anybody who's in the room, in such a way that when you start to do the practice, your inner knowing, probably not your intellect, but your inner knowing, knows what to do in order to develop in the right way, so that you don't go off at a tangent and get in a big muddle and waste lots of time and cause yourself lots of suffering. So that's my understanding of why you have an empowerment, because it's like a very pure taste of this, the essence of what that practice is all about, so that you can then embody it yourself accurately. And in that context, then it's in some ways it's much less powerful in terms of the incredible expansion I often felt when I was having these interviews with these teachers, which it really was a communion. And I'll come on to a little bit later about why that is so important in the context of Tibetan Buddhism. But in the empowerment setting, then again, it's all of those things I've just described, but probably toned down a little bit. So it's a shared experience with a group, and you do feel this settling down of your mind, this deep relaxation, this opening up of your energies. You're opening up into other dimensions. You're connecting with everybody else with a real sense of harmony. It's a oneness space, and everybody's in there together for the same purpose. And the blessing of the energy, the blessing of the empowerment will be working on each of us individually, often in ways that we can't identify. But it is about activating those particular qualities associated with the deity in this context, that essentially is about wisdom and compassion in different forms. So within Tibetan Buddhism, one of the reasons why I think this relationship between the teacher and the disciple, or the teacher and the student, or the guru and the disciple is so important, is because they talk about the fast track. Vajrayana Tibetan Buddhism is the fast track to enlightenment. And when you have a very close relationship with a teacher, your mind and their mind merge in such a way that you no longer have a sense of your individual self. So my Anna person would disappear when I was with Akon Rinpoche, and what would happen would be that we would just be sharing this expanded mind together. Akon Rinpoche was often seen as an emanation of the medicine Buddha, so he was an incredible healer. So anybody who went to see him would often have an experience of wellness and healing, I suppose, through an encounter with him. But I think as I grew to understand a little bit more about what might actually be happening in these encounters, my sense was that his enlightened mind was touching my enlightened mind and bringing it forward, so that there was less and less of a sense of distinction between him and me. And there was just this great, big, expanded, rather blissful, but grounded, blissful, harmonious, loving, compassionate peace between us. And I would leave the room, and that experience of me being that would last, not for long enough, but it would last for some time.
Great.
Emerging.
I want to give a different perspective. Buddhism often talks about the mind. I'm talking about Tibetan Buddhism. And I think it's better to focus on the concept of energy, because from my perspective, that situations like this where that Rinpoche was able to vibrate just like you, in a sense, duplicate you within his own energy patterns. And when that happens when a highly developed person, their energetic functionality becomes available to us. And it's the energetic intensity along with the consciousness that makes a difference. I mean, consciousness is there in the books, but it doesn't have the same impact as with being in the actual energy field, which can happen distance. I mean, 10,000 miles away. It doesn't have to be in physical proximity. As the communicator becomes more and more energetic developed and has a greater energetic intensity functionality. So I think, without going into a whole lot of explanation, that it's looking at it from an energetic point of view rather than a mind point of view. It helps me understand it in a much deeper way. And in fact, these empowerment ceremonies, such as the White Tara, empowerment ceremony, which you're involved with, is really what it is a collection of energetic abilities, so the person has skillful means to function a certain way that we label with this concept, this mental concept called White Tara. And it's really, it's the energetic abilities. And we, as humans, we like to personify, anthropomorphize, give a human concept to make sense. I think, like, the Christian God is white hair, long beard, long robes in the sky. Well, that's a concept, but there can be an energy that is not dependent upon the concept, but it's hard for most humans to relate to the concept or the mind. Well, if you have the mind image, it's easier to relate to it. But what is really there is the energetic intensity, which can be done in total silence. And that's why you sit at the master's feet, quote unquote, for years, because what he or she is transmitting, radiating, it is there. And so being able to go into that context, you were very, very fortunate, from my point of view, to have such an opportunity so that your inner knowing can at least see, perceive, sense what's going on, even though that doesn't mean you can integrate it into your daily activities and functioning and psychology that much, but at least it's sort of a, now that's it. That's the light at the end of the tunnel, because now there's a light there. Anyway, that's some of my thoughts on that. Do you want to explain a little bit about the White Tara, since I brought that up? And you're so deeply involved in that perspective from what you've said in the past. It sounds, especially what you were telling me earlier about that concept is about life force, which is both healing and sexuality. The life force.
Yes, that's what I've come to understand, because over the course of my training, it emerged that my particular practice was White Tara. Most people have one practice that they will relate to very naturally, very strongly. And White Tara is my yidam, is a technical term. And she has qualities of healing, long life, vital life force, and prosperity and wisdom. Those are the qualities that are associated with white Tara. And as I've come to understand the nature of that energy more, because she's depicted as a very peaceful, pure, white, angelic looking, in a Tibetan context, angelic looking being. So she doesn't look at all sexual. In fact, you can imagine her being entirely celibate. That seems the nature of white Tara, is this kind of a purity to her. But she has this capacity to generate life force energy, because that's what we need for wholeness and healing. That's what we need for a long life. That's what we need for vitality. So when you do white Tara practice, you're calling in all the elements, the 5 elements that make up the human form, the essence of them. You're calling in all these powerful life force energies. And of course, one of the most potent life force energies, if not the most potent one, is our sexual energy. So after a while, I began to see that far from white Tara and my sexual nature being at odds with each other, or being slightly kind of not really together, I could see that they really were, absolutely were together, that the more sexual energy that is being generated, then in the context of a white Tara practice, that's absolutely fantastic, because that's juicy, lovely life force energy, which you can use for your own healing. You can use for simply long life or vitality. It's all coming through in that way. So I have begun to see that the sexual energy is actually really an intrinsic part of white Tara practice, but it isn't, again, like we were talking about in the earlier session here, it isn't something that you're taught to work with in a direct fashion. So it's something that you learn to recognize and to include, and then to use the energy that's being generated for either transforming your own system, or for looking into the very nature of desire itself and being able to see and distinguish what's going on, and to see, what is really going on when desire is coming up, what is really happening. So there's obviously the physiological impetus to be with another person, and to perhaps find pleasure, or to express love, or whatever the reasons that we all know when sexual energy comes up, what it wants. But what do we want through it? And I think that's a really interesting question as well. When you take that question to the practice, what do I want through this, really want? And I think what I would say for myself is, what I really want is union with all that is. It might appear to be a man, in my case, it might appear to be a lover, but when that happens, then the masculine and the feminine come together externally, but internally, that's also what's happening. There's an intra-psychic union between the masculine and the feminine within me, and through that is what brings the opposites together, brings polarity together, if you like, or creates polarity, and allows this expanded whole complete feeling of self, which is not confined anymore by the human body or the human mind. It is just this experience of, I am everything. This is me. There is no me, and this is all me. And I think that's what is really what I am really looking for, and maybe many of us are really looking for when we go into when we experience desire and we go into sexual union. It is that belonging, that complete merging with everything that is, and knowing that that's the fullness of who we are.
Great. One comment I would like to say before we complete this is an observation, sort of a theory that I'm exploring here, is that a lot of the reason we seek sexual interaction is to have the orgasmic experience. And that what comes with the orgasmic experience, the orgasm, is a generating of energy. Usually we think in terms of pleasure, sensation, contraction of muscles in the body, emotional release or emotional increase in some way. And if we step back from those other perspectives and look at the orgasm as a way of generating more energy, I suspect that what people are often looking for in sexual activity is that energy, but it's not identified as energy. It's a type of energy that we could call the life force. And it's there, and it's one of the few contexts where we can increase it. And that's in the state of orgasm. And I'm referring to sexual orgasm. But there are other types of energetic and mystical experiences that I would also call orgasm. And that if one is able to go deeply and develop the ability to really generate this energy in ways other than in sexual activity, it is much easier to be celibate without having sexual activity, because a lot of the desire that we're seeking is being gratified through a meditative type of experience, if you're developed enough to be able to do that. Most people are not developed enough to do that, it's my perspective. So that what I'm arguing here, in a sense, for is that celibacy can be a very valid path if we know how to relate to it energetically, but they aren't, if any tradition is teaching it, they aren't making it obvious. Very, very, very few people, except for maybe like the lamas you're talking about, when I read their energies, I would say, yeah, I bet they're developed enough to they just generate energy so that this sexual desire, spiritual desire are really just an attraction to greater energetic intensity. And so that to me is the key, whether you're sexually active physically or not. In a practical sense, when for most of us, most of our lives, that's going to be a real question to explore. But if you become developed enough with your meditative practice, and in a certain way, which not many people are teaching as far as I can tell, there are ways to generate the energy which takes off some of the edge of horniness. Now, falling in love with companionship, that's another story.
It's a whole other podcast, Ray.
It's a whole other podcast. Which I know nothing about falling. I know about falling in love, but relationship is not my forte. Energy and sensuality, but not relationship. So, any final things you would like to complete this podcast with, about sharing with viewers and listeners here? Anything?
I think just that, yes, there's a big difference between enforced celibacy and natural celibacy.
Yes.
Yes. The first one will lead to lots of problems. The second one is fine. It's exactly as you described. You're ready for it. It happens naturally. You don't have all that craving going on, and there's enough connection with one's inner self and one's own energy field and one's own being that becomes self-pleasuring in a general unsexual kind of way, if that makes sense.
Yes. And of course, we have the biological factor when we're 18 and when we're 36. Horny.
It gets easier as you get older.
it is something that biological. It's a tendency for that biological factor to shift a little bit. And I do recommend having an ongoing daily meditative practice where you're focusing within, tuning into one's energy. So Anna, thank you for helping us to open some of the questions, to explore, and again, for people who are in a spiritual path and they feel like their sexual desire is in conflict. Well, welcome to the ball game. You got to embrace all aspects of ourselves for the anger, the sadness, the joy, the sexual desire, and being able to relate to those. Of course, that's what a lot of, well, at least the Buddhist and Tibetan Buddhist focus has been on, is how to relate to that, transform it. And so, thank you very much, Anna. And you can reach her if you wish to contact her. She gives white Tara ceremonies. Is that empowerments, would you call it?
No, in terms of the white Tara work, I do healing work, which can be at a distance, and I teach. So I introduce people to white Tara, and I do teaching days. Those are in person. And I work with a sound therapist a lot of the time, but sometimes I work on my own as well.
All right. She is at www.white, WHITE hyphen Tara, TARA.co.uk. And hopefully we hear more about this in a book sometime in the future here. No Going Back, A Quest for Enlightenment. If the listeners want to support this podcast series, which is free, please go to my website, sexualshaman.com, and click on the Be a Patron button. There are other podcasts, videocasts there as well. And if you want to, again, the sponsor of this series at this point would be my training program called the Energy Training. If you want to go deeply into developing certain methodologies and approaches to functioning energetically in certain ways, then I encourage you to consider that. And thank you so much for joining in, everyone. And we'll be back next week with another exploration into conversations on sexuality and spirituality. Anna, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.